Michigan trees, beginner to identification. In our first video, we looked at the basics of tree identification skills. More specifically, we started by looking at the actual characteristics of leaves, the different types of leaves in their arrangement, which you might recall. Today, we're going to focus more on autumn and winter identification. Autumn and winter identification. Now, there are several important things to note about autumn and winter identification. First and foremost, it can be more difficult to beginners because you lack the characteristic leaves that each deciduous species might have. So for things like conifers, where the needles are present during the actual autumn and winter months, which is the case for many species, including pines, spruce, and cedars, it doesn't really matter what time. They're just as easy to identify in the winter. But for deciduous hardwood trees, it could be much more difficult in the wintertime, especially if you've never done it before. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at an introduction to twig identification. Twig identification, twig identification. So we're going to skip a couple pages ahead past where we were last time. Okay. So we're going to first talk a little bit about the different kinds of twigs and shoots. So typically, when we're talking about twigs, we're referring to a fine unit of branch. That is, branches that are made up of twigs. In its most restrictive definition, it may be only the current year's shoots. But generally, twigs refer to a small branch that is made up of several to many annual shoots. So essentially, this is where the new growth of leaves will be attached to on a tree. So there are many different ways to categorize and break down shoots, but right now we're going to focus primarily on deciduous hardwood species, as they're the ones that you might benefit the most from knowing how to read their leaf scars and their buds from. Okay, so in figure 8 here, we see the shoots of a black walnut and American elm in their winter conditions. So there are several parts of the shoot or twig that I want to go over and identify, as they are very helpful at distinguishing two closely related species from each other. So let's look at the image on the left first, which is the black walnut. The black walnut. The black walnut possesses several characteristics during the winter time that allow you to identify it without the presence of leaves. For instance, one of the most helpful traits specifically on the black walnut is the bundle and leaf scars. So this is what occurs after the leaf has detached or fallen from the twig or shoot during the autumn or winter. So normally right here would have a leaf coming off of it during the summertime in the spring. But in the winter we don't have that anymore. We are left with bundle and leaf scars. This is the remnants from the vascular supply to the actual leaf itself. So typically what we see above the leaf scar itself is the bud. So this little lump here, which is more clearly defined on the American elm, which is our right example, is the winter bud for what will be next year's new growth of leaves. We can also see that there are many different kinds of buds. So we have bud scale scars at the base of the twig and shoot. And we have superposed buds, which go directly above the leaf scar itself. And the lateral bud is sort of this smaller one that's kind of lower in position on the twig or shoot than the main bud itself, the superposed bud. We also have flower buds, which is the case on American elm. And so these characteristics are several of the different features you can use to identify trees in the winter. We also have false terminal buds, plant's identification feature. They appear to be the final bud, which usually occurs at the end of a twig or shoot. However, it is not the case. They go sideways, and this is the case with the American elm. Whereas in the black walnut, they have a proper terminal bud. And this proper terminal bud is, as the name would suggest, terminal. It's at the very end of the branch. You have this little bud, this little bud, this little bud. Some other key anatomy features are anatomical features of the lenticles. Lenticles are how plants, and especially woody plants, undergo respiration. So these act as little ways for oxygen and carbon dioxide to come and go within the actual wood itself. You might also hear the word pubescence thrown around. That refers to essentially a small coat of downy hair-like fibers which can cover different parts of a tree or a plant. So as the case with the black walnut, you see pubescence along the shoots and twigs, which gives it a fuzzy appearance and texture. Now there's also the amount of chambers in the pith, which, if you don't know, the pith is the center of the shoot. So if you cut it in half or snap it cleanly off the tree for identification, the actual characteristics of the pith itself can be useful at determining what species you're looking at. So let's go ahead and look at a few more examples. Okay. So I want to draw your attention to a section of the twigs and petioles that illustrate the position of vascular tissues on a few different deciduous species. So in our examples here, we are looking at the vascularization as a means of identification. So these little dots represent the vascular system that supplies the fresh leaf with all the nutrients it needs. Now in ash trees, they form a U shape and are quite easy to identify. An oak tree, they're more randomly distributed and sort of even throughout the whole mass of the scar itself. And in maple trees, it's much more pronounced. You have very few of them. In this case, we only have 3 that are sort of equidistant from each other, similar to the ash, but with a lesser number. Now, when we're looking at pith, as I was saying on the last page, we have different characteristics. So the center of the shoot itself may either be chambered and or hollow, or have diaphragmed pith. It could be chambered, or it could be continuous, as in the case here. Now let's talk about some characteristic winter end buds of tree species. This is again something you'd use during the fall and winter if you had to identify species. So in our example here, we can see the terminal bud in A. That's of a sugar maple. We can see that it's relatively symmetrical and short. In the big-tooth aspen, we have what is known as a false terminal bud. So we can see that there is sort of a very small, looks like a leaf scar beside the terminal bud. This is what we call a false terminal bud because it is not truly at the very end of the shoot. We could see on the big-tooth aspen that it's downy. So, like I was saying in the last page, pubescence is one of the words we use to describe when something has a light coat of down or hair on it, which is the case for the big-tooth aspen. Then we look at C, which is the American beech. Now these are very easy to identify in the winter because they have long, hard, and sharp buds. So these buds are known as imbricate scales. So they're very tightly formed, very hard, and actually they kind of feel like thorns. If you've ever walked in the bush during the fall and winter and you've poked yourself with a beech tree, you can attest that they are quite sharp. And our example D here is a white oak, which has a large cluster of buds right at the end of the shoots. And another very interesting example of a bud that you might not see in many species is E, which is a valvate type of bud, which is seen on the tulip tree. Tulip trees as a duck's bill. They kind of look like a duck bill, or a platypus even. That's what one of my old professors would call them to help us identify them. Okay, and our last example is a naked bud, which is something you'd find in a bitternut hickory. So it's not protected by any sort of outer casing, it's exposed and you can see the soft tissue. So in bitternut hickories, another identification feature is that they're bright sulfur yellow, and that's different from many of the other hickory species, which have more brownish and harder buds, especially terminal buds. Okay. Let's quickly take a look at the inflorescence, just for fun, right? So we won't do this in winter tree identification most of the time, but every once in a while it's fun to just talk about this. So